This is the third quilt I've made using this pattern, and for this version I added 5-inch borders to make it bigger. This is a close-up of the block and the quilting. The block finishes at 8 inches, and for each fat quarter you can get up to 4 blocks. This shows the 5-inch border I added to make this one bigger. The binding has not been put on this quilt yet. And here is the backing I used. This is the first quilt I made with this pattern, and I used fat quarters, and it's made with fabrics from the collection called Best of Texas from Moda. This quilt was given to a veteran as part of the Quilt of Valor program. And finally, this is the second quilt I made from the pattern, and I used grays and blacks and tans, and amazingly I still have this quilt. The pattern we're using for this quilt is called Sleight of Hand. It makes a 58 by 76 inch quilt. It's written by Weeks Ringel and Bill Kerr of the Modern Quilt Studio, and it's a free download from the Binnertex website. If you look in the description below the video, you'll have a link directly to download this pattern. The pattern, I cut it and sewed it slightly different than what the pattern calls for. The pattern calls for 18 different fabrics from one of their collections from a few years ago, but I used 16 different fat quarters, and I'll show you the 2 places where I cut it differently. Down at the bottom of the first page, we are going to pay attention to this one right here in the middle, because this is the fat quarters, and this is how you cut the fat quarters. So that's one change I made. I used 16 fat quarters and cut 3 pieces from each fat quarter. The other change I made was it calls to cut these 18 inches by 4 inches. And when you subcut these later, you're going to cut them into 4.5 pieces, and you need exactly 18 inches to do that. And I found that after piecing and pressing and using starch, sometimes the strip was a little bit shorter. So I suggest cutting this 18.5 inches. So add an extra 1/2 inch to the length of these 3 pieces. And if you do that, then up here, when you cut the background fabric, the second line here says you cut 42 18 inches by 1 inch strip. In this case, since we used all fat quarters, we're going to cut 48 pieces, and instead of cutting them 18 inches, we're going to cut them 18.5. So the differences here are you're going to cut 48 pieces at 18.5 times 1 inch. Now, following the diagram to cut the fat quarters, we cut off the selvages, and then we cut 3 pieces at 18.5 inches by 4 inches. And then these are the scraps left over and the larger scrap at the bottom. You could probably get another piece out of here if you wanted to, and you would get 4 blocks per fat quarter, so you would need less fat quarters. I always suggest that you cut enough fabric to piece 1 block. That way you can make sure that you're cutting the right things, or that it's even a block that you want to do. You might decide you don't even want to do that block. But just to make sure before you cut all of your fabric that you've pieced a test block, and then go ahead and cut the rest of your fabric. So after you've cut the fat quarters, you're going to cut the background, and here are the instructions here. These first 3 pieces that you cut are going to be for the borders and for the horizontal sashing strips. And they ask you to cut these on the lengthwise grain. If you're not familiar with cutting on the lengthwise grain, look in the description, and there's a link to my video that shows how to fold and cut fabric on the lengthwise grain. And you will do this first, do these 3 pieces first. The first line is you're cutting 2 pieces for the top and bottom borders, and they give you the exact length as 58.5 inches. I would cut it longer And once you piece the quilt and you're ready to stitch these on, then you can measure the quilt and cut these to the correct size. But just for now, cut them a little bit larger than they ask for. So the first line is you cut 2 pieces for the top and bottom border. That's these borders right here and right here. And the next 2 pieces are for the side borders. And the next 7 pieces are for these horizontal sashings between the rows of the block. From the remaining white solid, you're going to skip the first one where you cut 24 at 4.5 by 1 inch strips. This is only if you used not all fat quarters. And the second one says to cut 42 18 inches by 1 inch strips. Now, if you're using all fat quarters, you're going to cut 48 instead. And if you cut them bigger, the fat quarters longer, you're going to cut these at 18.5 by 1 inches. And then the last one you'll cut is 40 pieces at 1.5 by 8.5 inch pieces. And these are the sashing here, the vertical sashing between the blocks. So here are my 4 pieces for the borders, and I've cut them longer than they called for. And here are my 7 strips for the horizontal sashing, and I also cut those longer than they called for. And these are my 8.5 by 1 inch segments for the vertical sashing, goes here between the blocks. And here are my 18.5 by 1 inch strips for the fat quarters. Once you've laid out all of your blocks, you're going to start sewing the rows together. And between each block, you're going to sew a sashing strip. Now, these are only going between the blocks. There's nothing going on the outer edges. After all the rows have been sewn together, you're going to sew a horizontal sashing strip between each row. So now I'm going to show you how I sew the sashing strip onto the row. This is the horizontal sashing strip. And this is the same method I use for borders. So borders and sashings are going to be the same way. Take one of your rows or several of your rows and measure the entire width that you're going to add your sashing to. Then take your sashing strip and cut it to the same width. Next, you're going to find the very center of your row. Just fold it in half and place a pin right at the halfway mark. Open this up and do the same thing with the sashing strip. Find the center and place a pin at the center. Even if you have an even amount of blocks and you say you have 6 blocks across, block to block, and you just go to the 3rd block and place the pin there, that sometimes may not be the very center, so that's why I fold it each time. Now, when I sew a piece of fabric like this that's not pieced onto a pieced row or just the pieced quilt top, I put the seams, the pieced side, toward the feed dogs. So I have these down, and put your border on top. So we're going to match the 2 pins and pin. Then we're going to go to the other side and match up one side and put a pin there. And then depending on how long your piece is, you're going to start doing halves. So just lay it flat, even up the edge, and put a pin in. And then go halfway between here and the other pin and put a pin in. And you can do this as many times as you need for your pins. And once you do this, go to the other side and do the same thing. Even up the edges, go to the center and pin. Now the reason I put the piece side down to the feed dogs is these sashing strips were cut on the lengthwise grain. That means there is no give to them. They don't stretch at all. They stretch a little bit in the other direction, but they don't stretch at all. So if you ever have to ease in anything, say something slightly different, and you put this at the bottom, the feed dogs are just going to be taking that and pushing it along. So if you put the feed dogs next to these seams, it will take the seams in and sort of ease in as you stitch. And when you stitch this on, you're going to start at the first end, take a few stitches and stop with your needle down and take the pin out. And then just stitch from this area, this pin to this pin. When you get here, take the pin out. And if there's any easing that needs to be done, you just do it between the pins and go all the way down to get to the end. Now when you have a row that has a sashing strip sewn on and you're going to sew it to the next row, so the sashing will be between the two rows. You also have these vertical sashings and you need to line them up from this row to this row. So if you just sort of willy-nilly or just match the ends in the center, you might be off slightly. If we take a piece of paper and we lay it along the edge of this sashing strip, you see where it ends down here. So we want these to end up like this. We want to be sure they line up perfectly all the way down the row. And this is how I do that. Instead of finding the center and going from the center out, we're going to go start at the end and then we're going to go to each sashing strip and address each one separately. So I start by the sashing strip that's already sewn on. I lay a straight edge. In this case, I'm just using a piece of paper. You can use a ruler or whatever you want. And right along the edge of this paper, I'm going to place a pin. So the pin is even with the edge of the paper. And do the same thing on this side. Line it up, the edge of the sashing, and place a pin right there. And do that all the way down. Once you've marked all of your vertical sashings with your pins, we're going to take the row that we're going to sew it on and flip it over. And since we want the seam lines to be against the feed dogs, we're going to turn this entire thing over. So now we have our pins at the top. And we're going to start by just matching the pins with the seam lines from the bottom. So here are the pins, and you flip it over like this and you can see they'll match just like that. So flip those and pin. And do that all the way down, and then also put a pin at the very end and stitch the two together. Now after you've sewn all the rows together and that part of the quilt top is finished, you're going to do your borders, and these are the pieces you cut on the lengthwise grain. You're going to do this borders the same way you did the sashing. You're going to measure the sides of the borders first, cut two pieces to that size, and stitch them on the sides of the quilt top. Then do the same thing for the top and bottom and use these two pieces for the top and bottom, and then your quilt top is finished.